This is a production of Cornell University.
I am going to give a lot of overview of different things today. As my bio showed, I have my hands in a ton of different things, but all unified around Earth observations for agricultural assessment. And so it's really just a difference of who's doing it and at what scale and for what purpose. Most of what I talk about today is going to be the NASA Harvest program, of which I'm a co-founder and I'm the deputy director and program manager. And it's NASA's Food Security and Agriculture program. But because so much of what we do is international and connected with so many different entities, I'll try and highlight those connections where it's relevant. She introduced me, don't really need to say too much here. I do use the pronoun she, her. I think that was obvious from my bio as well. So I'm going to start giving a little bit of an overview of remote sensing of agriculture. I know you guys are all agriculture folks. Not sure how many of you are working in the remote sensing domain. I'm not going to get too basic here, but I'm just kind of going to give a history that I think is really useful for understanding why we're in kind of a different period now than we have been in the first, say, 40 to 45 years of agricultural remote sensing, and why that matters for the type of work that we're doing. So basically in 1972, NASA launched its first Earth observing satellite, which is retrospectively known as Landsat-1. But when it was launched, it was ERTS-1, Earth Resources Technology Satellite. And actually the very first applications of that satellite were agricultural assessment, crop type identification, crop area assessment, and crop yield. And considering how well that started out, earliest studies introduced NDVI, Jim Tucker, who's actually still active at NASA today. It's kind of surprising that it didn't kind of follow the same upward trajectory all that time. And so there's still kind of a lot of potential yet to be realized, but progress has accelerated massively, and I'll talk about why that is. And I kind of always put this out there at the beginning, one of the issues was over-promising of what remote sensing and satellite data could do. And I try to be very conscientious of that and not say, that's it, we can do it, that's all, folks. But we are seeing that massively like in the sort of digital tech startup space, being like, we can do this at this accuracy, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not so sure those claims are always accurate. So at any rate, like I mentioned, the first satellites were launched in the early 1970s. And this was something written kind of in the mid 1970s. There were some early kind of handheld or aerial photography type stuff down in the late 60s and early 70s. And this first manual of remote sensing was saying, monitoring agriculture from space could be accomplished with greater than 90% crop identification accuracy. Yes, true still today. We can do that. Have we been able to do that across all cropping systems consistently throughout time and space? No. So that's a challenge. And that's 45 plus years ago now. And then in spite of tremendous obstacles and variables involved, many believe that automatic systems of tone signature and multispectral imagery recognition will eventually enable us to differentiate crops and evaluate farm practices on an automated basis with little to no human intervention. Again, this is 1975, and that is very much not how we're operating today. We do have, of course, a lot of very advanced farm informatics from robots, from apps and things like that, but the human factor is a factor. You're never going to remove that from agricultural management, at least not anytime soon. So there was a lot of optimism. What really happened? To just kind of summarize it quickly, great promise early on experiments. Early satellites launched in the 80s. A really bad thing, in my opinion, happened, which is that NASA and USGS, who kind of NASA launches and USGS operates Landsat, decided under the Reagan administration to commercialize this public good satellite, which is effectively, I mean, first of all, it was not run well. And secondly, it effectively killed the ability for anybody to develop research because of the cost of the data. And so that is a huge reason there was a pause in progress. In the early 2000s, the director of USGS's Earth Science Division, I can't remember the exact role, her name is Barbara Ryan. She pushed and made the heavy case that freely and openly available data is the only way we're going to get value from satellite data. And she was right. And so in the mid 2000s, Landsat opened up its full archive. And the amount that was basically the precursor to the development of, for example, Google Earth and Google Maps that we all use today, was enabled by the liberation of decades of data that had been collected. And the amount of scenes downloaded was in the kind of thousands to 100,000s per year. And now it's in the millions to hundreds of millions per year because people are able to utilize the data to advance the science. So that was a huge leap forward. But there was still, up until very recently, a mismatch of temporal and spatial resolutions of the instrument versus the promised agricultural applications. If the only thing you can image is the size of a football field or a soccer field, how useful is that to a farmer? How useful is that for them making decisions if their entire field or significant portions of it, especially in more smallholder systems outside the US, or like very high value crops, are all blurred into a single signal with maybe some trees and surrounding vegetation mixed in? Not very useful. Plus, we had limits on computation, limits on satellite overpass, and on the data acquired. Just very quickly, I won't get too far into this, but this is what I talk about when I talk about satellite overpass and satellite data availability. This research is getting a little bit old now. It was actually my dissertation research, but basically the Landsat missions were kind of the workhorse of the Earth observation world besides MODIS up until about 2013, 2014. 2014 when the European Space Agency started launching their missions. But if you look at this map, the Landsat mission was only capable of collecting 250 scenes per day because of how much storage there was available on board and how often they had to downlink the scenes. And so that resulted in some pretty sparse coverage. You're not getting global coverage on a daily basis. And even so, the satellite only passed over the same spot on Earth every 16 days. So there were places in the world that you wouldn't get a single image in a year. There were places, agricultural places in the world, where you were lucky if you got one image, and it may be covered by clouds. And so it really wasn't a practicable agricultural assessment tool. So in 2014, 2015, I assessed the basically revisit capabilities of a bunch of different satellite missions and what I call constellations or virtual constellations. And I was looking at different Landsats, that's the L7, L8, Landsat 7, Landsat 8, which each had a 16-day overpass, with the new ESA mission, Sentinel-2A, Sentinel-2B, which each had a 5-day overpass, and then ResourceSat-2, which is an Indian satellite that the USDA actually had been using for years because of issues with Landsat. And essentially, different, if you optimally put multiple of them together, you're looking at like less than 2 days almost everywhere globally. Now we're starting to talk about something that can actually be useful for agricultural assessment. But then once you combine that with cloud coverage, on the top is, you need your pixel or you need a scene to be 70% clear. The bottom is you need it to be 95% clear, so a much lower tolerance for cloud cover. There's actually still places all over the world where crops were very importantly growing that you were going to be missing your acquisitions, even with that 2-day revisit frequency between all those optimized satellites. And so basically, even the best case scenario, the gaps in moderate resolution coverage of critical agricultural areas and times is still and was still limiting the utility of satellite data for even large scale agricultural assessment, much less kind of subfield. So basically backing up a little bit, I kind of touched on the first big shift for ag. It was around opening up data and kind of changing the discussion around the cost structures for satellite data. And then at the same time, this international research community of different people using satellite data for a variety of purposes, not just agriculture, called GEO, Group on Earth Observations, started pulling people together from around the world to kind of talk about, well, what do we need? And how can this data be used? And so GEO had an agriculture group. Their first meeting is in that photo below. This was before I joined the team, but the NASA Harvest director and chief scientist, so the other two founders, were a part of that meeting early on. And I joined about 2 years later, in time for the proposal to be written to the G20 to make this agricultural monitoring program using satellite data an official G20 mandated program. And that's called GeoGLAM. And so Inbal, who's in the front, the NASA Harvest Director, and I both serve as program scientists for that. Katie mentioned the crop monitor reports that come out. In that capacity, that's where I do the Latin American leadership. And then I also do the consulting with the space agencies, representing our thematic community back to them. So that was a big shift, coalescing the international community. And then the other was, like I mentioned, since 2015, since that research that I just showed, these satellites have been launched, and more SAR satellites that can see through clouds have been launched. And so suddenly cloud cover is less of an issue. The research around utilizing SAR data for agricultural assessment is growing rapidly. And so practical applications are more possible than ever before. And then also the private companies, big disruptors like Planet. Maxar and Airbus were around for a while before that, but kind of changing paradigms in the cost of launching these small satellites, and the quality of their data has gone through the roof. And at the same time, cloud computing and machine learning techniques kind of enable these huge volumes of data to be processed and analyzed, and meaningful information to be extracted. I just really briefly want to touch on GeoGLAM just to kind of show what the policy relevance is. So this is monthly wheat prices from 1960 to 2019. You can see I mentioned Landsat 1 was launched, and its very first applications were in agriculture. And that was really because it kind of coincided with this period when, crop prices were pretty stable. And then all of a sudden we entered this period, not only of them going a first price hike going up, and a sort of second price hike, but also just a huge increase in volatility, which is really difficult for producers, threatens food security, has impacts on all kinds of other markets that are not just agricultural as well. And so after two sort of huge price hikes in 2008 and then in 2010 and 11, related to drought and related to, as the G20 saw it, speculation in the market. Some people knew about these droughts, some people knew about production shortfalls before others, and bought up crops or whatever would happen. The G20 thought, well, we need transparency, and what better for transparency than satellite data? So that's really when GeoGLAM was established as a monitoring entity. Our mandate has been re-established multiple times since that 2011 initial establishment by the G20. And in fact, in 2018, it was explicitly broadened to include food security. So not just focusing on agricultural assessments for calming markets, but also agricultural assessments for combating food insecurity, providing early warning of crop shortages, and kind of strengthening the international community's ability to respond to food shortages without too proactive of an action that makes it really difficult for the local producers in that area to maintain their livelihood, because that's also a concern. And at the same time, we're also not just limited to that. We're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Paris Climate Accord. I mean, the point here is they're big policy drivers that pull the international community together to work on developing the national, regional, and global systems for monitoring. So anyway, this is GeoGLAM at a glance, 98 and counting organizations in 46 different countries. We've got two regional networks operating, the one in Latin America and then the one in Asia that's explicitly focused on rice, that the Japanese Aerospace and Exploration Agency runs. And we have 8 thematic teams. We just launched one maybe 2 weeks ago that's focused on in situ data. So a big barrier to the advancement of remote sensing is we need great ground data. We can't operate remote sensing without great ground data for calibration, validation, and for us to really ground our methods in what's really happening. And so the data that's collected is often poor quality. We don't have standards for how the data are collected that are adopted across the community. And so that's now, as a community, what we're trying to do. And I think it's actually going to go pretty well. This is a quick glance at the crop monitor. We have 2 global bulletins that come out monthly. Soon there'll be 3. This is the crop monitor for AMIS. This is the specific one. Actually, no, I'm sorry, this isn't. This is the combined crop monitor. This is crop monitor for AMIS and early warning put together into a single map. AMIS is the agricultural market information system. So this is really about the reducing volatility in the markets. The early warning one, which sort of geographically is like Central America, parts of South and Southeast Asia. A lot of that is also production of rice for large trade. And then a lot of Africa is considered a part of the crop monitor for early warning. That's really more for sort of the humanitarian perspective. And so what you can see when you look at it really quickly, this is, policy geared. We're not giving complicated biophysical variables. We're not giving, really difficult comments to parse through with lots of kind of conditionalities. This is really aimed that an economist or a statistician or a grain trader can take a look at this and be like, okay, so I know this area is really important for soybean and maize production, and it looks like it's in kind of watch or poor condition for a lot of it. So, I'm going to keep an eye on that, or I'm going to keep that in mind when I think about global grain production. I'm going to skip over this because I can tell I'm already being kind of verbose. So this is another thing that we do a lot. I wanted to just give a quick plug to this regional network of GeoGlam, which is called Agricultural Monitoring in the Americas, AMA, and we do a lot of sort of international collaboration, methods sharing, international research sites. And this is an example of a 5-day workshop that we hosted at University of Maryland with representatives from ministries of agriculture in Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and Brazil. And at the end of it, they sort of walked away with 30-meter spatial resolution crop maps, so not crop type, but crop non-crop maps for the current year, or at this point actually it was the year before, and the ability to redeploy it in their current year. And Brazil actually now operationally utilizes this methodology to do their area assessment. So then from this, they take, they build a stratified sample visit, and then they build out their area for soybean and maize. So that's about it on GeoGlam that I'll talk about. But I wanted to kind of highlight that global international picture. Now, this is really NASA's program. This is really focused on many of the same things that GeoGlam is, because of the overlap in leadership and the overlap in priorities as we see them. But this one has kind of an increase in focus on both US domestic agriculture, but also on sustainability, and also, which GeoGlam doesn't really look at. It's really a production area statistics kind of program. And we're really looking at the sort of sustainability picture and all of these things. We operate as a multi-sectoral consortium of over 50 organizations worldwide. The diagram is kind of roughly divided. On the left are sort of the public research or public agricultural ministries, things like that, universities on the left, and on the right, we have a lot of private sector partners ranging from kind of informatics to reinsurance to grain estimators and traders to space agencies to consumer goods companies to input suppliers. We basically have a lot of those different folks involved in the consortium because their needs, their kind of applications are really what drive the work that we do. We've been around since 2017, and in that time, as I mentioned, we have over 50 partners and over 30 active funded projects. And we have a lot of other projects too that are kind of leveraged off of funding dollars, so that we can kind of amplify our impact with a relatively small budget, to be honest. And at the bottom is a picture of our consortium from mid 2019. So we've grown since then, but that was the one in-person meeting we've had so far. The gist of this diagram is that we're really aiming in Harvest to improve land use, sustainability, and productivity in agricultural systems. And we're doing that through advancing the methods to utilize satellite data for crop mapping, statistics, yield, condition assessment, and cropping practice mapping and assessment. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. Like I said, driven by stakeholders, driven by their needs. We're not a foundational research project or program. We are the applied sciences program for NASA. So we're really about bringing impact to users. In the US, we have sort of 6 focus areas supporting USDA's methods. And so that might be supporting their national agricultural assessment, or their kind of economic research service, but it's also supporting foreign agricultural service in their global estimations of crop conditions, transitioning new methods over to them and bringing new technologies to them. We work a lot, our kind of priority research area in the US is within season yield and area, but also on mapping and identifying the impact of land management practices on agricultural sustainability and kind of soil health and all, and watershed health and things like that. We're also really spending a lot of time on supporting private sector innovation, and just in general trying to improve the productivity of US agriculture while reducing and mitigating its impact on climate. And then potentially, there's lots of discussion these days about making agriculture climate positive, which again, I'll get to in a moment. I want to give a couple of examples of NASA Harvest impact. This is in Uganda. So historically, they basically had to, they're kind of operating in the dark. And they were reacting to crop failure after it happened. So people were already hungry, already in trouble. And a reaction is always more expensive than prevention or proactive response to something. And so in 2017, after working with us through Dr. Catherine Nakalembe, who is incredible, and I encourage you to just Google her, go to our website and read about her. She herself is Ugandan, did her PhD at University of Maryland, and then continues to work for us. She's the Harvest Africa program director. She has developed and fostered personal relationships with ministers of agriculture all over sub-Saharan Africa, but in particular in Eastern Africa. And the first big one, not surprisingly, was down the road from her house. She's from Kampala and was with the Office of the Prime Minister. And so she worked with them and showed them, after her fieldwork and seeing devastation in the Karamoja region, said like, look, we can see this in satellite data. You don't have to wait to find this out. And so in 2017, they actually saw there was no way the crops were coming back. They were not going to recover. And rather than waiting for farmers to continue to toil away in their fields, they were able to institute a program of giving funds to farmers to buy new supplies and resow their fields and start their season over, and kind of prevent a massive food shortage. They save money in the process, but really importantly, 150,000 people, farmers who would have been kind of in a really bad situation, were able to maintain their livelihoods and not reach the point of devastating hunger. Another example, this is a kind of COVID-19 response. This was last year. The Togolese government contacted us and said, we need to help our farmers, and we don't know where they are. We don't really have a sense of who's cultivating where, and we have no idea how to distribute this aid that we have to farmers so that they can continue to cultivate food for us as global trade is shutting down in the face of COVID-19. And so we worked with the private sector Planet, a space data provider, and within 48 hours, they were acquiring data and providing it to us. And in 10 days, we turned around with a very accurate crop probability land cover classification for them to utilize to put this kind of aid program into effect. Another example of a public-private partnership that we had was with Swiss Re, which is a large agricultural reinsurer. And I think what I mostly want to highlight here is that we are starting to move into the very subnational, very highly localized, even sub-field heterogeneity in yields with satellite data, because we suddenly have these capabilities. And essentially what we did here was utilize satellite data to develop sort of a yield maps at both national scale and then sub-field scale to determine where do you really have to go in the country to develop a national scale yield assessment, how many places do you have to visit, and how many places in a farm do you have to do crop cuts in order to get a reliable field level yield estimate. And we use satellite data to train those optimization algorithms, collected the data, and then use satellite data to kind of scale them to national scale. And in result, Swiss Re is ecstatic because they don't have to send out as many loss adjusters and pay them, and there's potential fraud in the billions of dollars or in the hundreds of millions of dollars every year from loss adjusters not entering the data correctly or false or committing fraud, essentially. And then now they can kind of avoid that. And then for us, we got to massively improve our yield models at multiple scales of implementation. We just announced about 2 weeks ago this partnership with Cropx, which is a company that installs these within field little sensors on soil moisture and soil nutrients, and which are critically important to ensuring kind of the sustainability of agriculture moving forward. And again, we can utilize satellite data to optimize where in field you have to put these sensors. And then once you have the sensor information, how can you interpolate them to provide a full field worth of information? So this is kind of where we're pivoting toward, is this farmer-facing effort. The GeoGlam stuff and the precursors to harvest were all really government, early warning, trade, economists, big, large-scale pictures in aggregate. We're now starting to be able, because of the satellite data and the methods that are available, we're able to really pivot toward the farmers. And I think that that's quite important, because who controls the land? Farmers. It's really what it comes down to. The future of our food system is with farmers. And so when we're looking ahead to these big global problems like climate change, feeding 10 billion by 2050, all of the decisions that are going to reform agricultural production are going to be implemented by individuals. And so we need to start considering their data needs at that scale. And that's because climate's changing, more people are food insecure each year, we're rapidly degrading our agricultural lands. Some estimates 30 soccer fields of topsoil per minute, with, if we do nothing, done out of topsoil by 2065, which means agricultural yield is going to go right in the bucket. Doesn't matter how much area you cultivate, how many forested areas you cut down to create new agricultural fields. If you keep degrading it, you're going to run out. But it's worth, you've got a lot of these governments and corporates who are racing to meet these challenges. I don't know how many of you follow sort of agricultural news, but just in the 10 or 12 weeks or whatever since Biden was inaugurated in the US, there's an announcement of utilizing the Commodity Credit Corporation's $30 or $33 billion per year cap on aiding farmers to just create a climate bank and pay carbon markets. But it's like, okay, how are you going to measure that? What are the changes that you're going to expect farmers to make, and how are you going to measure their impact? And so, I think it's worth asking, what can be changed and how can we measure it? So you can obviously change land management practices and all the nuance therein. And you can detect the changes utilizing satellite data to an extent. You have to integrate it with field data and models to derive any meaning about what's happening below the soil. But can we use sort of these above ground biophysical variables to tell us more about what's happening with respect to soil health? And of course, yes, carbon sequestration, which is the hot topic of the moment right now. Just quickly to note, this came out only a couple of days ago, I think last week, talking about the ways in which emissions could be reduced from the US food system. And I've circled in orange the ones that are kind of related more or less to agricultural land use. So like refrigeration, not so applicable to what we do, but a significant portion of this emissions reduction, and this is just carbon dioxide. They're not really even talking about methane and nitrous oxide and other sort of agricultural emissions, but a lot of this is really going to happen through finite implementation of changes of agricultural land use. But at the same time, there really is not consensus about how to do that and how to do it equitably, how to do it accurately, how to do it equitably. And there's a lot of critique coming from the science community, as we've seen carbon markets around forests fail. In the top right, this was just a week ago or so as well. The Nature Conservancy was like, uh-oh, we have been selling, forest carbon credits on forests that have no threat. So essentially we're giving people a license to pollute that's based on something that was never a threat to begin with. So we're actually doing harm. And that's a lot more common than I think we realize. And so as Biden and others in Europe, the Green Deal, they start to unveil these plans, I should say, on utilizing agriculture to reduce carbon emissions or just to sequester carbon. And they're talking about financializing that. We better be pretty cautious. It's right now, it's sort of the Wild West. Sustainable and regenerative actually have no real meaning that's enforceable, has no real meaning in terms of agreement across science, what that includes. And yet, farmers are sitting here going, they're hearing all this buzz and they're going, how on earth can we get in on this? Or what are we supposed, what do we have to be prepared for? What do we have to change? How's this going to work? They need practical advice on to make changes if the changes are applicable or relevant to them. National and global policies are being formed. Agribusiness is aiming to meet their kind of 2030 commitments, largely associated with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are at least close to a dozen independent carbon markets in the US that have like essentially no oversight whatsoever. And Biden's plan is to just buy credits from them as opposed to creating a unified carbon bank. And again, with no oversight. So it's like, they could just be putting money into their system without actually having any environmental impact, and farmers may not benefit. And again, it all comes down to that individual land user. They implement a new practice and they don't get paid justly for it, they're going to stop, and you've wasted an opportunity. So essentially, there's a lot of need for information and knowledge, and we need to build it up at scale quickly. So, just to say, there's this real focus on the commodification of agricultural carbon. And it's following very much the same trajectory as forest carbon did 15, 20 years ago. But it's being euphemized, in my opinion, by co-opting the phrase regenerative agriculture. I am a total believer in regenerative agriculture, but not as it's starting to be discussed these days. And that's because I think everybody is focusing on regeneration as just sequestering already emitted carbon. That really undermines the true value of those practices, when in reality, the loss of topsoil, the loss of yields over time on farms is a huge threat to food security, a huge threat to sort of microclimates, nearby streams being experiencing eutrophication as a result of excess nitrogen being poured onto the farms because they're not able to get the same yields out of it. There are a lot of reasons why we would want to implement these regenerative, quote unquote, regenerative agricultural practices that have nothing to do with the financialization of carbon. And so that's really kind of the message I'm trying to send to a lot of the different folks I talk to wearing my policy hat or my NASA hat, is like, look, there are these practices that we know in certain locations certainly have lots of benefits, including in some case carbon sequestration, but that's not the only benefit. And there's no universally accepted definition, but my sort of working definition for conceptualizing regenerative agriculture is that there are locally appropriate cropland and rangeland management practices that aim to stop and reverse soil erosion, rebuild topsoil, increase soil organic matter, improve the biota of the soil, enhance ecosystem services and watershed health, reduce the need for chemical and biological inputs, and contribute to increased farm resilience in the face of climate change. And these are all really good reasons for doing this, but they lack a quantitative basis at scale. And so here comes the NASA Harvest Sustainable and Regenerative Agriculture Initiative, or SARA for short, which we've recently launched as a public good, fully transparent, multi-stakeholder, pre-competitive forum. That's whole purpose is to pull together like kind of the best of science with the priorities of industry and policymakers to rapidly build that evidence base and the measurement kind of modalities to have common yardsticks for sustainable and regenerative agricultural implementation. And so there's, like I said, there's key knowledge gaps. What practices work where? What impacts do they have in different places? And there's so many nuances within these practices. They often talk about cover crop as sort of a monolith. There's so much variation in that. Tillage, there's so much variation in how deep you till, how often you till, the type of tillage that you do, whether you do strips or the whole farm at once, the structural conservation management, and what happens when you use these things in tandem? What happens when you use them over only every 10 years versus every 5 years? All of these are questions to which we really don't have answers, but there's a lot of potential here. And so satellites tell scalable stories. This shows county level yield, but we can get down to subfield level yield variability. And we've done that now with satellites, drones, and in situ data. This is some work from University of Illinois, from Kai-Yu Guan in the center, looking at canopy nitrogen uptake in some croplands in Illinois. And he's using it to essentially see at what point do you stop seeing a benefit of additional pounds of nitrogen being added to a farm. Reduced nitrogen usage is reduced emissions carbon to bring it to your farm, nitrous oxide from the emissions themselves, methane emissions from fertilizer production. All of those things are huge. Not to mention, you don't have your nitrogen wash into your nearby stream beds and watersheds and kind of destroy them for fishing and other functions, and obviously just ecosystem services. And then on the right, tillage impacts that we're seeing, this is in the US Corn Belt, obviously. And I think what's really interesting here, the scale bar is yield difference after 10 years. And the traditional understanding of tillage impacts on yield is that tillage means you have reduced yield. But in reality, after 10 years, what Jill's research, she's from Stanford, showed is that most places actually have a yield benefit. That's an important nuance there, because if you're giving a person carbon payments, for example, for tillage adoption, eventually the carbon is going to saturate on that farm. You're not going to be able to sequester any further carbon in that soil. But is there still a benefit to the farmer? Are they going to be able to continue to not till and keep that soil that carbon that they did sequester in the soil? Well, if there's a yield benefit, there's a lot more likelihood that they will be. And so lastly, so what do we do in the SARA initiative? We bring together agricultural stakeholders from public and private sectors to really understand their needs, their priorities. The reality is I'm sort of a pragmatist here. I'm very critical. I don't know that that's come across, of carbon markets. Very critical of greenwashing, very aware that it's happening. I don't really think that we're in a position to halt that as scientists. And I also don't really feel like that's our role. But what we can do is, and I hope I've shown this to you today, is there's a lot of other reasons why you would do these practices that they're looking to financialize through carbon. And I see, as again, the pragmatic person within me, well, why don't we figure out the best ways to do this? Why don't we figure out where the maximum benefits can be experienced and the minimum harm can happen? And if some companies get rich in the meantime, okay, but we can also actually achieve the goals that I think they're being marketed at this moment. And so then we're convening top scientists and practitioners to answer the key questions that I see as missing. Where are farmers already adopting these different management practices? What are the impacts individually and as a sort of multivariate situation on farm health, climate mitigation, from field to global scales? A choice that's made in Illinois, we've seen with the expansion of corn for biofuels, having row crop expansion in Brazil to fill that market gap. What are the impacts both on that farm and the broader watershed and internationally? How do these practices vary through time, space, and landscape? And how do their impacts vary? That example I showed from Jill is here again. I love this study because it revealed something that countered an assumption that existed in so many biogeochemical cycling models, is that you do this practice and there's only one possible outcome. There are a range of outcomes. And that's a really important thing for us to know before building any incentivized system. And so we have the SARA science team that's mostly public. We do have Regrow and Applied Geosolutions, who are private companies that are a part of it, and we're trying to grow it. I haven't spoken very much or really at all about sort of the more precision management in pest management, for example, and that's how Katie and I have started to discuss some collaborations together. Using the blunt instrument of whole field spraying doesn't have to be the future. You could have early disease detection utilizing machine learning and a mix of in situ and satellite methods to reduce the amount of spraying that takes place on an agricultural piece of land, and overall, support soil health and all of that. And so SARA is a subset of harvest, like I mentioned. We've got that whole big harvest program, but then we have this specific pre-competitive forum for pulling together the private sector and public sector together. And it was really strategically built to operate at arm's length from contribution. So if we get data or we get money from the private sector, everything comes in as a no strings attached gift, which means that it's not up to them what we focus on research wise. It's up to us. And we have a website built already that will enable full accounting of dollars in, dollars out. And the idea is, hopefully, as a pre-competitive forum, we can kind of build those common yardsticks and frame cross-industry discussion around what can and should be incentivized and rewarded. in a way that's supportive of actual benefit and not just enriching the people participating in the markets. And I just will say, you know, we're seeking to grow the Sarah Science team. I'm still doing the fundraising, but we're also open to partnerships and things like that that can help answer some of these questions and make it all a reality. And so I'm excited to get to know you guys at Cornell, and I'm happy now to take any questions that you might have. And I think I stayed to time, so I'm gonna just give myself a pat on the back about that.
You did. Nice job. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alyssa, for that talk. So now we're going to open it up to questions. So if you guys want to send questions to the chat, I'll read them to Alyssa. I will get started with one of my own, though. So just to kind of kick things off. So Cornell has a rich history in specialty crop agriculture. So basically all these like non-commoditized crop, it's a generalized term. So I was just wondering about your thoughts on the future of specialty crop participation in these initiatives, the use of Earth observations for specialty crop growers and their diverse and specific needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tied to the same trends that we see enabling general farm level or sub-farm kind of performance and analytics, which is that, you know, we can collect much finer resolution information, which inherently has a much larger data volume, and we have sort of the computational systems to extract meaning from that. But the research world in agricultural assessment using satellite data was certainly built around commodity crops. But there are horticultural applications that absolutely exist, and sort of higher value crops that require maybe less machinery to produce and more hands-on work. I think it's like a little bit more of a research domain in a sense, and it's going to be the analyses will have to be very multi-point. You know, you're going to have to integrate with in-field robotic sensors, with satellite, with drone, with in situ, with soil samples, with everything for it to be useful. But things are becoming constantly cheaper, data and informatics. And so I think the potential is there eventually for the costs associated with that data collection and analysis to be worth it to the producers. I just don't know that we're quite there yet. It's more of a research question, so it involves a little bit of the public funding to kind of get those use cases off the ground if the companies themselves are not going to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Have some questions here. So we have a broad question from Chris Smart, the director of SIPS here, and she asks, what are the costs?
What are the costs?
Chris, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sorry, unmuting. Yeah, you said that, you know, you weren't sure if the return on investment, essentially for specialty crops, was there because of the costs. So my question is, what are the costs? I work on specialty crops.
All right. Okay. So, for example, if you know, I know in the viticultural world, when I talk to my friends, because that's my personal background, you know, they're really interested in like root zone soil moisture. And the degree of precision within sort of within a single row, it's like a per crop, per plant, I should say, is really what the level at which they're looking to fine tune their information. So commercial satellite data from Planet, from Maxar would be the best fit for that type of analysis, because the publicly available free data is a little bit too coarse for that kind of granularity of analysis. So between sort of like the installation of the within field networks to measure some points of root zone soil moisture, and then the satellite observations to kind of scale it across the entire production zone, are really where the costs come in. And then there's, of course, I mean, so if like NASA Harvest is not an operational service provider, that's not our role, is to like, you know, operationally inform farmers how to monitor stuff. We would love to empower somebody else to do that, whether it's a growers association or a private company. We're interested in the research that kind of underpins that. So they will have costs associated with their operations. You know, and so we can build a research case with NASA funding or USDA funding or whomever it may come through. But the forward-looking operationalization of it is going to be sort of a commercial or a growers association that would actually roll out the implementation of it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
some more questions in the chat. We have Kandikuri Rahman asks, any thoughts on predicting current and future threats to agricultural production by small scale farmers in Africa?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. So like this past year, I mean, again, I adore Catherine as a person and also as a researcher. Her dedication is incredible. So that's why I'm always like, look, hear her words directly. She's on Twitter. She talks on LinkedIn. And there's also information on our website. She's been heavily working on the locust outbreak last year as it coincided with COVID-19. And so you've got kind of multiple environmental and human natural systems like catastrophes happening at the same time. And how we respond to them. I mean, not to be too technocratic about a solution, but early warning is invaluable. And the sort of synoptic look that something like remote sensing can provide for early warning is really valuable for also where do you need to go zoom in? Where do you need to send boots on the ground? Where do you need to send out people to like do an in-depth assessment? And so, yeah, I mean, there's between climate change, continued geopolitical destabilization, and then things like locusts and soil degradation. Those are some of, I think, one of the biggest threats for sure.
Absolutely. Kind of along those lines, I'm going to jump around with these questions in the chat, though I do hope to get to all of them. Marcellus Acevedo, one of our faculty in Triple PMB, asks for disease and pathogen and pest predictions. What are the main constraints you perceive as facing our use of Earth observations for such?
I mean, I feel like Katie probably has a better answer to this question.
Well, there's a reason why I picked. but like in your perspective, working at this global scale,
yeah,
what are the challenges you see?
It's not dissimilar to the horticultural or the non-commodity crop question, which is just public investment in research has been the dominant driver of satellite observations for agriculture until very recently. And that has been focused on large commodity crop production. And so, you know, looking at some of the kind of finer level disease detection has not been necessarily the priority in a way that you would respond to it. Like the locust invasion in Eastern Africa, for example, it wasn't like we were utilizing that information, or the design was to utilize that information to go out and like selectively spray for locusts or something like that. There isn't the underlying infrastructure to implement that. It was really more like, okay, what's the damage and what are our options? And so I think similarly, biologicals and chemicals have been readily available and inexpensive. And so it's often easier to just go out and spray everything, even if you don't have a problem, just like preemptively spray. And then rather than go out and assess like, this is exactly what's happening, because the methods weren't necessarily there.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Alyssa. So I'm going to go back up in the chat. So just a quick question from Adam Bogdanov. He wants to know if NASA Harvest is connected to other federal agencies invested in agriculture, such as NSF or DOE?
Yeah, so DOE, I'm actually actively in communication with the ARPA-E program and trying to find a modality for joint solicitations between NASA and DOE. They're working a lot on like very intensive field sampling around soil nutrients, in particular carbon. And don't really have a vision for scaling it. And I think that that's where remote sensing can be very applicable for both the kind of taking their measurements, building models, and then seeing about applicability and feasibility. So we're in discussions around that. For NSF as well, we have had some discussions in USDA also. USDA has their SAS solicitation that I think the grant things were due this week or something like that. Sustainable Agricultural Systems, $150 million. We're in contact with Megan O'Rourke, who's the program manager for that, about trying again to see, you know, any of these projects having a geospatial analysis overlaid on top of them is going to be beneficial. And I think for us, our model is rather than having standalone projects that are fully integrated as NASA Harvest, we would rather work with existing expertise and existing projects in a variety of domains to bring geospatial and remote sensing information where it's useful.
Great. Okay, so we've got a question about carbon markets from Christina Tenito. So she asked, she's worried about how the financial sector will drive agricultural practices based on profit, but not necessarily achieving the best ecosystem services outcome. So what are some strategies to mitigate funding driving practice rather than information, maybe with a lens towards how can satellite and Earth observations help with that?
So, I mean, this is me too, right? So definitely me too. I'm concerned about that as well. And I'm concerned also about it essentially spoiling what is, I think, a very good opportunity for us to move forward practices that have a lot of benefit if we just bank on one specific outcome. There are some calls, like the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Association put out like a statement or an analysis about kind of where things are. And they were saying, well, why don't we look at sort of the practices themselves and their broader values as opposed to tying the financial incentives to specific commodified outcomes. And there's pushback for a lot of reasons around that on the other side. But this is almost like a strategy question, and it's something I grapple with a lot. And it's why I'm spending a lot of my time these days. I was on the phone with one of the president of one of the largest CPGs in the world this morning and talking to them about like, look, like hold your horses. They're telling you that this carbon system is ready. It is not, and like your brand reputation is at risk. And here's why. And like, let me demonstrate a case that shows this to you. And so I'm trying to urge kind of a little bit of caution and show them that there are benefits that are available, but like you're going to cut off your nose to spite your face if you push too strongly in the direction of something we've already seen fail massively, which was REDD+ and general carbon to markets. So anyway, so I it's a hard question to answer. I don't have the perfect answer strategically for how to confront that. But I mean, I guess I'm hoping that by getting the research out there quickly, that, if there's a NASA stamp, a multi-research organization stamp, I'm like, no, this is the reality, that you can't really ignore that in a financial sector, not for too long, at least.
Yeah. So we've got time for one more question. So we have a question from Paul, who didn't share his last name, so I don't know which Paul he is. But he thanks you for your talk, as do we all, and just wants to know if you could expand a little bit on the countries that do not currently have crop monitoring. Are these related to climate conditions, small markets, technologies? Is it they've declined to participate? What is the barrier to getting everybody in on the game?
This is also a really great question, and actually speaks to like a deeper part of my background. The carbon stuff is a little bit more recent. So like a lot of the work that I've done over the past decade is on institutional change and working with organizations to incorporate Earth observations into their data streams. And I can speak, for example, to my work in Latin America, because it's a large area of focus for me. And it's not uniform across that. It's a huge, very diverse region, both in terms of culture and climate and agricultural systems. But Central America is an example where there really are very limited, if any, agricultural monitoring happening. When I showed you that map of the crop monitor that we put out, there was a report for Central America that comes from the USAID Family Health Warning Systems Network. So it's not internal reporting, whereas the reports from Brazil and Argentina come from their respective ministries of agriculture. And so we've been working, I've been working with them for the past several years to try and build up that capacity. And it's not just about like the lack of personnel who are in the role to do this. It's also, some of it in Central America is honestly a cloud cover challenge. I touched on this earlier, that up until very recently we were only dealing with optical satellites, which can't see through clouds. And this was kind of a common issue in India as well. The monsoon blocks out like the majority of their growing season. So agricultural assessment using standard optical sensors, not very useful. By the way, NASA and ISRO in India are launching a joint STAR mission, which can see through clouds, which has an explicit agricultural application. That's really going to change things. And Canada has one already, Europe has one already. And so we're now working on trying to develop the methods that utilize these data that are applicable to the target crops in Central America as a first cut. Is this even feasible? And then the second cut is that, and at the same time, we're engaging with university students there, building up kind of like the next generation workforce and training those who are in the ministry now. And by training, I mean more like bringing awareness of how these have been used, say in Tanzania, which has sort of similar field sizes, different cultivation regimes, different challenges, but similar biophysical characteristics that they're dealing with, and showing like, look, this works. We can do this here. Let's see if this works for bananas here. Let's see if this works for coffee. Let's see if this works for cocoa. Let's see if this works for your rice system, things that are really important to you guys. So it's like a kind of a compendium of research and advancing the methods, building awareness within the institutions about the functions, and building up the workforce of people who are in country and dedicated to kind of answering these questions in future generations. And then there's always a challenge of political turnover. That's a huge one. Huge. You build up these great relationships in ministries. There's a new person elected, and unlike the US, where typically they just change the top level political appointees, often you get the entire institution from top to bottom is hollowed out. And so building up the continuity within that institute, my approach to it this is where I heavily leverage the global program GeoGlam, which is to say, if that institute has signed on to participating in this global mandate, that continues to mandate the national system for that organization, even as personnel change. Yes, we have to do the work over again, but at least they are already like, well, we agreed to do this, so we're there from start. Hope that helps. It's an extremely complicated and difficult and challenging place to work.
Yeah, it sounds like a difficult situation, but glad people like you are working on it. Right. Awesome. So that's all the time we have. I want to remind the students and postdocs that at 1:30, so 4 minutes, you have an opportunity to chat with Alyssa. Unfortunately, there's no free lunch because it's COVID, but so hopefully I encourage you all to attend and just chat with her and ask her questions if you didn't get to do in the chat. But thank you so much for joining us. That was a wonderful talk. So I'm just going to give you a round of applause just on behalf of everyone else.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us today. And I look forward to talking to you this afternoon.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.